Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. Today is March the 31st, 2026. It's the last day of Women's History Month. In reality, every day is a part of women's history since women are central in all of creation. In any event, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the second part of my discussion on the book of Esther, right? Because Esther is a significant figure in the book Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, right? Esther was a queen, and I to me, many historians we say that she spoke the bravest words in the Bible. If I die, I die. So I started the first part, and I'm going to continue now. And also, this book is particularly it's pivotal at this moment. Of course, there's the ongoing U.S.-Israeli war versus Iran. Of course, the Iranians are the Persians, right? In the Bible, the situation, the location of the Book of Esther, it was actually within the Persian Empire. The specific city was Susa. Susa is still a historical landmark today in Iran. It was called Shushan. It's called referred to as Shushan in the Book of Esther in the Bible. So a lot of history in this Book of Esther that I'm going to be discussing today. And Esther herself was Jewish, right? So the state of Israel, of course, claims descent from Jewish people. You know, they're Jewish people. Their religion, national religion, their identity is Jewish. So you see how this is sort of very pivotal, very crucial, and there's that intersection of that confluence of historical undercurrents going on, and that's a reason I'm going to be discussing it. Now, before I delve into the story is very interesting. I'm going to discuss the rest of the story. I'd started in the first part, but I'm going to complete it. But I'm going to do an analysis because this book of Esther is often very confused, right? People misinterpret the book as God sanctioning genocide, using it as an example of an instance when example of when Jewish people committed genocide and that it was approved by God. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Well, the thing is, a lot of the Old Testament, right? I'm a Christian. I'm not proselytizing. I'm I'm discussing this from the point of view of a historian and somebody who studied the Bible, right? Who studies the Bible and the history of the church. Uh, but there's often a lot of misinterpretation of the Bible when, especially the Old Testament, when it's taken in literal terms instead of the allegorical context, without reference to the allegorical context, right? A lot of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, has allegory in it, there's symbolism in it, right? So certain things are not to be taken literally, right? As you know, there should be a bigger context, a symbolic relevance, and so that's what I'm going to try and do after I discuss the story. I'll give the narrative. Uh, I'm going to also use a guide post, a frame of reference. I'm going to quickly read this to get it out of the way and I'll explain. So I want to use as a frame of reference Matthew chapter 3, verse 9. That's in the New Testament, right? The New Testament is what Christians use, right? New Testament of the Bible, Matthew chapter 3, verse 9. I'm going to read it. You could check it up on your own, but I'm going to quickly read it. And so Matthew chapter 3, verse 9, it says, "And think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father. For I say unto you that God is able to, of these stones, to raise up children unto Abraham." Right? So let me read it again. Sorry, this is from the Old King James Bible version, right? It's the original King James version of the Bible, right? Of 1611. So that's Matthew chapter 3, verse 9. "And think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father. For I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham, right? So what is this saying? It's literally saying that, okay, that uh, um, so that was John the Baptist, right? That was John the Baptist speaking, and he was addressing the Pharisees and Sadducees, right? They came to him, and he was trying to tell them that they shouldn't pull rank, right, as being children of Abraham, because, well, that God can raise anybody. In fact, these stones, right, that he was looking at, it was pointing at stones, that God can make stones children of Abraham, right? Remember that in the Old Testament, so God had actually made a covenant with with Abraham when he called out Abraham from Ur of the Chaldeans, right? Remember, that's Chaldeans, Ur of the Chaldeans, which was a one of the cities in Sumeria, right? I've discussed Sumeria, the very first civilization in the world, right? Sumeria is in modern day Iraq, right? Modern day Iraq, that's Mesopotamia, right? So Ur of the Chaldeans, that's where Abraham came from, and he's the ancestor. He was the ancestor of the Jewish people, and God made a covenant with him. Now, if we recall, though, that and this is what I'm going to be pointing out after I discuss the narrative, is to focus on the the uh, the Manichaean, what's called a Manichaean conflict of good versus evil. That's what Manichaean means when I say Manichaean conflict, right? That's uh, the significance of the war of good versus evil, right? So Abraham is called out from Ur of the Chaldeans, right? And he has a covenant with Abraham. That's God has a covenant with Abraham that he's going to bless him and his descendants, make him a father of a multitude of nations. And God changes his name from Abraham to Abraham, to symbolize this covenant. But um, what happens? We see that after God delivers the children of Israel out of Egypt, in the book of Exodus, chapter 32, right? After they were delivered out of bondage, 400 years of bondage, when the children of Israel built a golden calf, right, and abandoned God, right? They apostatized, right? They became apostates. And apostate means you turn from your belief, you turn from your religion. When they became apostates in the wilderness and went to start worshiping a golden calf, what did God do in there? In the book of Exodus, I'm sorry, my objective is not to proselytize, but I wanted to clarify uh, this the symbolism that people miss in the book of Esther, and where they misinterpret it, and they often abuse the Bible, saying, well, that genocide is approved in the Bible, or God may allow certain special people to commit genocide or whatnot. I wanted to clarify that that's inaccurate. You have to understand these wars in the Old Testament in terms of uh, Manichaean conflict, the concept of just reflecting the war between good uh, versus evil, right? That's what it is, right? And not a call to actually go and literally kill human beings, right? That's not what it is. So in the when they were in the wilderness in the Old Testament, right? You can verify this in Exodus 32. I'm not going to read from that. In the book of Exodus, chapter 32, God actually told Moses that, okay, he was going to destroy the children of Israel, and that covenant he'd done with Abraham, right? And that covenant he'd done with Abraham, and create a new covenant with Moses and his own descendants to make them a great nation, right? Because the idea was he had made this covenant with Abraham that his descendants will be great, they'll be a mighty, a great nation, right? But once they uh, became apostates, right, in the wilderness, they apostatized, went to worship a golden calf. What did God do? God said, well, he's going to destroy that covenant and create a new one entirely with Moses. So, and that confirms what John the Baptist was saying in Matthew uh, chapter 3, verse 9, which I just read from, which says that, okay, that look, God is able to raise children of Abraham from these very stones, because the symbolism of Abraham in the Old Testament was that he was a man of faith, right? He had faith in the one God, right? God said he was going to be father of the faithful, right? So faith is what's important, right? The faith, those who believe God to do what God uh, asks them to do, to surrender to God, right? In righteousness, in good, to do what is good. So it's in terms of the Manichaean conflict that they won't defile themselves. So that's the symbolism that you have to look to. At least that's what Christians understand that the Old Testament wars and conflicts to be. So in that book of Exodus, God didn't destroy the children of Israel because Moses interceded and he exhorted God that God should consider that, what the enemies of God would say, that it would be as if it would be because they would uh, make accusations that it's because God was not able to fulfill his promise. But my point in raising that is that once uh, children of Israel, once they showed that they would apostatize at any time, uh, then they would be, they would not be approved, right? They would no longer be approved at any time. This is very consistent in the Bible. Now, the other thing is we should also consider the notion of the laws that were in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, because that's what we're going to see. So I'm going to go into the narrative now. I've just provided the guidepost, right, the from Matthew 3, verse 9. And in fact, you see in the events later on, you see that people who weren't Jewish people actually converted and became Jews. So I'm going to just quickly give the story, narrate the story now. It's a very interesting book. It's not long, it's about 9 or 10 chapters. Um, so there's the Apocrypha, and I read the Apocrypha, right? The Apocrypha, that's the books of, doubtful authority. It has an additional uh, uh, chapters in passages in the book of Esther. Uh, so I had stopped at where um, the king of Persia, who now had the largest empire in the world. He was a grandson of Cyrus the Great. That's the Achaemenid Empire. I've done videos explaining what the Achaemenid Empire was. The Achaemenid Empire, it's in the Guinness Book of Records. Of course, that's in modern day Iran today. That's where the citadel is in modern day Iran. Persians are 60% of Iranians today. So the Achaemenids were Persians, and Cyrus the Great, they went on to establish what's called the largest empire ever, the largest nation ever in terms of their authority, their sovereignty over the proportion of the world's population, because they ruled almost half of the world's population at that time, um, roughly 49%. So today, of course, the world's population has grown far more. Uh, we're now about 8 billion. So you can imagine an empire that was ruling, say, 4 billion people. There's no such empire, no such nation today. China possibly has, sovereignty over the largest number of people. Well, in India, China, I guess if you add Taiwan and all those other places, I don't know, but China or India, because India just surpassed China in terms of population, just marginally. Well, it's a lot, but because they're both over 1.4 billion people. So there's no nation that's about 1/8, right, of the world's population. Not They don't have sovereignty, authority over what the Achaemenids of Persia had back then. So back to I'm trying to place us in the historical context, right, and it's very interesting. The king at the time was Ahasuerus, right? Ahasuerus That's the name that's used in the Bible. So that was the Hebrew version of his name, Ahasuerus, right? The Greek version of his name was Xerxes, right? Xerxes the first. If anybody's seen the movie 300, that was the same king at the time when the Persians wanted to go and conquer the Greeks. When they went to fight the Greeks, they fought the Spartans, and the Spartans and the Athenians, I think it was just both of them that were resisting because the Achaemenids, again, they dominated most of the world, and now they were trying to get the Greeks to submit to their sovereignty, as vassals. And these small groups, the Spartans, would resist them. But that's not the discussion right now. Just giving you the historical context, right? The narrative. Uh, so, because these are historical events, right? And so we're fortunate it's in the Bible. We have it in the Bible. The Jewish people recorded it, it's in the Bible. And as I've said before, uh, God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, which is I think it's the only book where God is never mentioned in in the book, right? And nobody really knows who the author of the book of Esther is. People assume it was Mordecai, and Mordecai, of course, was a cousin of Esther. She'd raised Esther. Esther was an orphan, and Ahasuerus, I'm going to just be referring him to Xerxes the first because Xerxes is easier to pronounce. They're the same person. So Xerxes is the Greek version of his name, right? So uh, so Xerxes eventually marries Esther. He doesn't know Esther is a Jew, right? He doesn't know she's Jewish, um, and Mordecai is her cousin. Now, some important things happen. So Mordecai, at some point, he used to sit at the gate of the king, right? Because the king of Persia was the emperor, was a king. By the way, the title of the kings of Persia used to be King of Kings, right? Because they had so many vassals under them, King of Kings. Today, I think the king, their last king, the Pahlavis, who was overthrown in 1979, they're still referred to as King of Kings, Shah and Shah. I think, yeah, Shah and Shah. If I can, I don't speak Persian. I think that's how they call him in Persian, Shah and Shah, the King of Kings, right? So he he used to stand at the gates of the king. That's Mordecai, who was a Jew, right? Uh, and he overheard a plot of the king's eunuchs. So eunuchs were very popular in those ancient empires because they lived in the household in the courts of the palaces of the kings back then. And the kings were, they had their harem, they were polygamous back then. And so to make sure that the children who were born in the royal household were really the king's children, because they didn't have, of course, they didn't have the DNA test technology that we have today, that you can verify through DNA who the paternity of a child. So they would castrate the men who worked within the king's households, and they were eunuchs, right? They were often eunuchs. Even Daniel in the book of Daniel was a Jew, right? So Daniel in the book of in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament. Sorry, it's not in the New Testament. It's in the Christian Holy Bible, but of course, it's from the Torah. Daniel was a eunuch, right? He was a Jewish person, but he was someone who was raised in the king's court. So that was during the Babylonian captivity. So uh, the people who worked in the king's palaces, many of them, because of their interactions, their access, proximity to the king's harem, the king's wives, the king's family, the daughters, they were often eunuchs, right? So, so there were so Mordecai overheard a plot by some eunuchs to kill to assassinate the king, and so he reported it, and this was foiled, and so they killed. Uh, those people were, of course, they were executed. But immediately, the king didn't immediately reward Mordecai, and this would come up later on. But let me just state it. Later on, the king would end up rewarding Mordecai. But right now, something else also happened that was very significant. There was a guy called Haman, right? Haman, it was called Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. So I'll just call him Haman the Agagite. And this is very significant. He was Haman the Agagite, and the king promoted him. Basically, he became like the most powerful of the king's servants, the king's courtiers. The courtier is somebody who works in the court. Think of it like the cabinet members that we have today to a president, a secretary of defense, secretary of state, and the cabinet. So they're the officials, the high government officials. So Haman was a high government official, and he was the highest. The king. Uh, Xerxes would promote him, Xerxes the first. So Xerxes promoted him to become the highest official then, and he gave an order that everybody was to bow down to him. This was the order of the king. And the Persian kings, they would codify their laws. You had to obey their laws, the laws of the Persian kings at that time. And so everybody was ordered to bow down um, to Haman after he was promoted, elevated to the significant position by King Xerxes. However, Mordecai, who was a Jew, did not bow down, refused to bow down to Haman. And the reason we're told in the book of Esther in the Bible, it says that because it says Mordecai was a Jew, and so because he was a Jew, he refused to bow down to Haman. And nobody, if you don't understand um, the biblical history very well, you wouldn't understand that because it's not, it's not self-explanatory when you see it there. But there's a history, right? Uh, um, why, uh, why Mordecai refused to bow down um, to Haman, right? Disobeying the order of the king. And the explanation in that book of Esther is because he was a Jew, right? So I'm going to quickly explain it now. That just means that the narrative is going to be longer. So I'm going to do one last video to conclude. So Haman was an Agagite, right? If anybody remembers in the Old Testament, King Agag was an Amalekite, right? He was an Amalekite whom King Saul had spared, right? In 1 Samuel chapter 15, you can see the story. So God had ordered King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, to destroy the Amalekites, basically exterminate them, right? And I'll explain why did God. So you see, we're seeing a lot of like genocidal instances, what we call genocide today. Why did God ask King Saul to exterminate the Amalekites? So the Amalekites, interestingly, they were the first people, right, that the children of Israel encountered when they were delivered out of bondage in Israel. Remember, it was God who delivered them, who set them free. The instrument of deliverance was Moses, right? The lawgiver Moses, a prophet, great prophet, right, who gave them the Mosaic laws. So, but the Amalekites, when they saw the children of Israel who had just been delivered, instead of giving them, helping them, they actually attacked them, right? They attacked them. So God sort of cursed them because of that, because they attacked them. When the children of Israel, they just come out of distress. Instead of helping them, they attacked them. So because of that, there was that rivalry between the children of Israel and the Amalekites. And it is more, what makes it more infuriating, right? More grievous is because the Amalekites were actually cousins of the children of Israel, right? They were actually cousins of the children of the Jewish people, right? How were they cousins? So remember Amalek, okay, Amalek was actually the grandson of Esau, right? Esau was a twin brother of Jacob. Jacob is a patriarch of the 12 tribes, right? The 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Um, Jacob, who, God's name changed his name to Israel, right? Jacob was his twin brother, was Esau, right? And then there was that conflict between them, and his grandson was Amalek. So Esau was the ancestor of the Amalekites, right? And so, but the Amalekites when the children of Israel were freed from bondage and they were going into the wilderness, trying to go towards Canaan, instead of helping them, they attacked them, and so uh, God had this anger against them, and He decreed that the children of Israel were to destroy them, right? And so when God ordered um, King Saul, the first king of Israel, to go to war, he he spared uh, he spared the king Agag, right, who is an ancestor of Haman. So, but the prophet Samuel, would go on and he would kill King Agag himself. So, uh, uh, it turns out, so Haman was actually an Amalekite. So there was already a conflict, a decree from God against the Amalekites, right? The Amalekites, there was that conflict already between the Jewish people and the Amalekites, right? The cousins, and God has sort of decreed their annihilation because the Amalekites were determined uh, to annihilate the Jewish people. There was something historical going on, this historical conflict, right? The conflict between Esau and and Jacob, right? And Esau, the Amalekites were descendants of Esau, and of course the Jewish people, descendants of the twin brother of Esau, Jacob. So, and this conflict actually had it goes back to the concept of the Manichaean conflict, the conflict between good and evil. So that's symbolic, right? So this is, in the Old Testament, these conflicts, these wars, they understood in terms of wars, right? Wars, but for us Christians, they're templates, they're symbolic, referring to the conflict between good and evil. Because for Christians, we don't go to war. We don't, right? We find war to be abhorrent, right? So Jesus said, if someone strikes you on the left cheek, you turn the right cheek, you turn the other cheek, right? So uh, we don't go to war for Christians. It's abhorrent. So those wars, those conflicts in the Old Testament, they're viewed as just a conflict between us, see them as a spiritual contest between good versus evil, not a sanction or green lighting violence against people. That, okay, well, people are bad, and so you should go and be violent against them. That's not what it is, right? So that was the basis of Mordecai refusing to bow down to um, uh, Haman, who was an Agagite, who was an Amalekite, right? Because there was already an order, instruction from God that the children of Israel should annihilate the Amalekites, but the Amalekites had not, and that they would continue to be a thorn to them. They would continue to be, right. They would continue to attack and oppress the Jewish people. But this is in terms of a Manichaean contest, right, of good versus evil, not in practical terms that, well, there's a group of people go and the Jewish people have been ordered to go and exterminate them. That's not actually how the book of Esther is to be read, or the Old Testament, right? So it's supposed to be a Manichaean, uh, has a Manichaean a reference frame to it. So, in any event, so when uh, Mordecai refuses to bow down, people try to persuade, other government officials try to persuade Mordecai to bow to him, because there will be dire consequences. So what Haman decided to do was very significant. Haman learned of the identity of Mordecai, that it was a Jew. So instead of punishing Mordecai specifically for his offense, because as an Amalekite, descendant of an Amalekite, and there was an old um, conflict, ancient rivalry between them, he decides he's going to use it as an opportunity to annihilate to all the Jewish people, uh, and to just commit genocide and exterminate them. So you see, he had that objective of committing genocide because of one person, that's Mordecai. And he goes to the king, King Xerxes, and tells him, well, there's this group of people who never obey the laws, right? So it was just one law, and there was a context, right, why he didn't want to obey that, in terms of his religious beliefs, right? And because of an instruction from God, which they abided by, So this also happened to Daniel, right? The Jewish people would not bow down to foreign gods, and so they were often persecuted also in the Roman Empire because they wouldn't worship the Roman gods, and including the Caesar, the emperor, because the Romans would often deify their emperor, so they wouldn't, and so they were persecuted because of this. But so Mordecai, sorry, uh, Haman goes to the king Xerxes and asks Xerxes to issue a decree to annihilate to annihilate all the Jewish people, and he offered that he would even pay 10,000 pieces of silver to any all the people those people who annihilate the Jewish people, and they'll put it in the treasuries of the king. So the king did consent, give a decree, right? So Xerxes was the because he didn't know. So Xerxes was the king of Persia. He gave a decree, and the Jewish people should be executed according to the plans of Haman. However, Mordecai, when he learned of this, and they sent out instructions to all the provinces. In the Bible, in the book of Esther, it says that the Persians ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. That's how it put it then. And so the letters were sent out, and for them to be exterminated at a certain time on a certain day. And but Mordecai, when he heard this, he goes to tell his cousin. He sends a message to Esther, who's queen at that time, but the king doesn't know she's Jewish. He doesn't know her identity, and they because Mordecai had instructed her to hide this, and so he tells her that, look, don't think because you're queen, and you live in the uh, you live in the palace that you'll be spared. The king has given an order to exterminate your people. And if they exterminate your people, it will eventually affect you. And he said, if you choose not to help, that God is going to definitely, he didn't say God, he did, but you will understand it as God. He didn't say God because, again, God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. It says that there will be help. Help will come to them somehow, and they won't be exterminated. So in any event, she is moved and decides to do something about it. That's Queen Esther. And she orders that, okay, all the Jewish people, Mordecai should order all the Jewish people in the land to fast for 3 days. And then she goes at, well, and she'll go and make the request. She'll go and petition the king. And that's when she said the words, if I die, I die. The reason she said that was because no one was allowed to go and see the king of Persia, to go and see Xerxes, without being called for in advance, right? They couldn't just go in and see the king without having been called. He has to call anybody that comes to his presence. I guess that's a security feature as well. So people couldn't plot against him or whatever, right? So then if anybody, there was a law that if anybody just goes to the king without being called to him, they would be executed, right? Unless the king, raises his scepter, just sort of is benign, and what's that? He's benign, and decides to waive uh, that law, that rule, to have them executed. It's basically part like a pardon, right? Pardoning them. So, and she asks that, okay, the children of Israel, the Jewish people, should fast for 3 days, and that she would go. And she said, if the king decides not to pardon her for breaking a law, and that if she dies, she dies. But this was very dire. I'll stop this video here, and I'll continue and round up with this very interesting story of Queen Esther. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.